All right, welcome back to another episode of Road to Emporia. Recently, we've gone through a lot of equipment testing. We had Robert Chung on and Josh kind of to talk about the importance of aero and rolling resistance and kind of how it's going to relate to my ride in Emporia and hopefully yours as well. So we thought, what better way to kind of take some of that data and figure out how it's important for you than to have Ryan Cooper from Best Bike Split on. He's one of the founders and recently started working with USA Cycling to help them model races for Olympic athletes. So brought him on. We're going to go through Best Bike Split and kind of how to use it for a gravel race. Some really, really interesting stuff. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. Let's jump over to Ryan. All right, so we're going to look at the Unbound 2022 course.
Yes, so I created just a generic athlete, kind of a FTP around 280, 170 pounds, training elevation around 1,000 feet, and so just kind of created a generic athlete to use as a modeling point. And in Best Bike Split, one of the things you can do is get a course file. So in this case, the Unbound course from 2022. And you can upload that as a GPX or a .fit file, and as you can see, Emporia, Kansas, and it'll upload the kind of the elevation and data around the course. Now, what we talked about earlier was kind of setting up a bike, and so from the Chung method, you went in and you have your bike, you have your weight of your bike, you kind of have details around that, and then you went and basically calculated a CDA and a rolling resistance. So one of the things we've done at Best Bike Split is kind of tried to simplify adding bikes. So we target triathlon, time trial, road bike, mountain bike, or gravel bike. And so we've kind of created some generic bike profiles that you can add that give you a baseline, because we tend to go into a lot of detail on different bike specifications. So if I add a default gravel bike, I already had one added, but I'll add another one, and then I'll go in and update this bike, and you can kind of see all the different characteristics that we look into. So I'll rename this one to just gravel bike, Unbound. We have different bike types, weight of a bike. In this case, if you go in, and this would be a complete bike, so meaning if you're going to have a spare kit on there, you're going to have something else. So it's kind of the total bike. And a lot of people are surprised, when they think about a bike, especially if there's a road bike or something, they're thinking, okay, this is a pretty light bike. It's 20 pounds or 18 pounds or 17 pounds or, 8 kilograms, whatever. But once it's fully loaded and you have everything that you need for the day or for race day, it can be a pretty heavy addition to it, right? I won't go into all the details, but if you go into wheel types, kind of the depth or the width, and so if you think of kind of a narrow wheel and all of that, you can kind of go into really specific details. But jumping down to the things that are important, rolling resistance and CDA. So the things that you've gone in and tested, and what we do is we pull the rolling resistance kind of off the bicycle tire rolling or bicycle rolling resistance.com data, and they test all of these tires kind of on what they consider an average road conditions. So not completely smooth, not a track surface, not smooth asphalt, but kind of average rolling conditions. So a little bit bumpy, a little bit grippy, right? And so we are pulling a baseline number off of that. But if you've gone and tested your bike on this kind of average rolling condition, average road surface, you can come in and put your own numbers in here. Similar with CDA, as you can see, we kind of have a climbing and a racing coefficient. So meaning, let's say you're climbing and you're kind of in this upright stance, and you're up on your bars or whatever, you're up on your hoods. You could go use the Chung method and test that and say, okay, here's what this climbing coefficient is, and typically, 0.34 to 0.4 is kind of the standard number. If you type that in, then we'll fill in what the equivalent yaw angles are. So you don't really need to worry about all of this data. It's just for the super kind of geeky aerodynamics nerds, they may come in and like really want to put the fine-tuned data in here if they've gone to the wind tunnel or something like that. So if you come in here and you say, okay, go ahead.
If you're game for it, I actually have those numbers from some of our own tests. I actually plugged them into my Best Bike Split account right before we started here. So, so on mine, we actually were right at 0.34 on the climbing in the hoods.
Okay.
And then some of our tests were done a little bit at a 2.5 degree yaw angle. So substitute that in for 0 for argument's sake. And then in the aero bars, we're at 0.2707.
Awesome. I'm going to update this bike. All right. And did you guys test CRR?
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So on the CRR, you mentioned that it was. You said something about it being on normal road conditions. So are you going to then modify that CRR number for gravel, or are you going to take whatever that is and use that?
No, so it gets modified. So in a minute, I'll kind of show how we do the course model, and then the CRR number gets modified based on the surface type that you select. So yes, so gravel would be always in addition to this, right? So it would be an uptick to this. Now, if you went and tested on gravel, so if you do have numbers there, you've gone and tested on gravel, we can sub that number in and then choose average roll, quote unquote average rolling, average surface conditions in the model, and then account for that, right? And so a lot of times, most of our testing, since we're grabbing them off of, kind of test data, and that's usually at that average, we tend to do it the other way. But if you're at home testing, then you can put that into this field and then choose average road surface conditions in the model, and then it'll just flow through.
Okay. Yeah. So I did just, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, did a test, and so plugged it into Golden Cheetah. I was on my my gravel bike, and it's 45 mil Pirelli Centurato H's. And the CRR came out to 004013.
Perfect. And that was just on the road?
Yeah, it was a not great road condition, but
yeah, perfect. All right. And so one of the other things I wanted to quickly jump into before we jump into the modeling is we have this relatively new feature called Athlete Analytics. And what it attempts to do is if you had a previous race file, so in this case I have a previous race file from an athlete last year at Unbound, it can bring that race file in, and then it does basically a summary analysis on it. And so it may take a minute to load here because it was a pretty dense file. But what we're basically doing is we're kind of looking over the course and then trying to do something similar to what you're doing with Golden Cheetah in terms of estimated drag, right? And so in this case, you can kind of look at what we're calling CDA clusters, which is a pretty dense chart, but you can see it's a little bit all over. But in general, the race, as you get faster, you can kind of see the line of where the average CDA is, which in this case for this athlete is, around that 0.35 kind of mark. So, I don't believe that this athlete had any kind of aero, was just kind of on a standard upright, more or less upright hoods position for most of the race. But it's just something to kind of give you an idea of what the demands of the race are. So if you looked at gradients, for instance, you can kind of see, okay, well, what kind of wattage did this athlete produce on grades from 8 to 10, and what kind of speeds were they seeing, right? So you can kind of go in and dissect the race in different ways. and it's a way to kind of judge effort levels. So in this case, the normalized power was 175, but the average power was only 132. So they had a very high variability index, meaning there was a lot of kind of on and off throughout the ride. So this is just another tool that we've added. You can put in previous gravel races and kind of use that as a baseline to say, okay, what should some of the parameters that I put in my model be for power, for minimum variability index, which is just the difference between your normalized power, which is kind of like your effort level, perceived effort level, versus your average power. Another thing I wanted to point out here was this is a over 14 hour race. If I look at it by time, you can see the areas, and I'll turn off some of these data points. You can see the areas where you were stopped, and so that's something to consider too. Like when you do the model, it's not going to say, okay, you need to take a 30-minute break here, right?
Yeah.
So it's just something that if you need to think about, okay, at some point during the day, I may need to stop down and recover, or I may need to stop at a rest stop. So adding those times kind of on top of the modeled time to kind of get that, what you think is actually going to happen on the day. So in this case, I think it was a little over, 20-minute stop there, and then earlier in the race there was a 10-minute stop here. So just something to kind of think about. We haven't pulled that out. At some point we'll kind of add that to the analysis, stop time, right, versus moving time, and those kind of things. So, all right, jumping back to the model, I'm gonna just create a new one. And so using your data, so we're call this we'll say it's 2023 since we don't have the course for 2023 in here currently. And I'm going to use your bike that we just set up as the baseline. So here's where we kind of have the different road selection types. And so we've used these, and these are averages. So they typical rolling resistance up, I guess if you use the standard tire and then we kind of pull that out and we kind of do a percentage up, right, for gravel. And so this means that when you select this, if you have a really good tire, so in your case, your tire was better than what our default one was, you'll still see that benefit in the overall.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what the terrain is in this course, but I'll say kind of deserty, plainy, but I don't really know if there's a lot of kind of obstructions across the course. And what this does essentially is it changes the way wind impacts the race. So if we pull in the weather, and what's the race date for this?
June 3rd this year.
June 3rd, all right. So I'm going to pull in race day. I think it starts at like 6 something. So
yeah, 6 in the morning.
Early start, if I remember correctly. So essentially what you can kind of think about is the terrain will impact some of the wind conditions. So like if you were in a very densely kind of densely forested area or something like that, you may not get impacted by crosswind so much, but you may get really impacted by headwind, right? Because it kind of funnels through that terrain. And so what the terrain setting here does is it basically tries to model that for the course. And so it does a pretty good job, but again, once you model it, again, it's just a model. So you'll have to kind of use it as a guideline, and then as you're out there on the day, you'll notice the differences, right? And then, do you have a target? I know you have a target time. Do you have a kind of a target power?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't tested in a couple weeks, but I think my FTP right now is about 280. Okay, so probably 65 IF, 0.65. So I think that comes out to about I think that comes out to about 180, right? Yeah, you can on the screen there.
Yeah. I think my modeled athlete was right around 280 as well on FTP, so that's perfect.
Yeah, model athlete is
one of the settings
looked like
here,
me a little while ago, a few pounds ago.
All right, so maybe to lower. Yeah, so one of the things that we've also added, and this is very useful for things like gravel or mountain bike, is this minimum VI setting, meaning that if you're doing like a time trial or a triathlon or something, like a lot of times you don't really want to vary the power all that much. The general rule of thumb is like 1.05 or less for like a time trial. That's not super hilly, right? So, but what you find is in these really hilly races or these demanding, mountain bike races or things like that, where there's a little bit more technical, or you have these surgy hills and your gearing ratio is only so much. Like you can only spin so slow at some points, right, going up a hill. And so the general rule of thumb that we've kind of seen for gravel racing is that a lot of times it's closer to 1.15, 1.1 to 1.15, and for a lot of mountain bike racing, it's 1.15 to 1.3. And if you remember from the race file that I showed, it was 1.3 VI for this kind of race. I'm going to set it to 1.5 as just like a starting point, and then you can kind of play with that with other models. So I'm going to run that. And I'll be very curious to see. Like, I think that arrow, if you can stay in that arrow, it's going to be a pretty quick time. So
yeah. I think the numbers we came out, the numbers that we tested on that bike were at 50K, it was 120 watts to be in the aero bars over the hoods.
Okay, yeah.
Of savings.
So, I mean, that's a huge difference. So if you look at this, I mean, 11 hours is kind of what it's looking at for a model. Now, that doesn't include any stoppage time. If I go back to my original model that had the 0.35, that was a much higher number. It was closer to 12 hours or a little over 12 hours. And so this is kind of a baseline. So you can say, okay, if I'm averaging 151 watts and I can maintain that aero position through every place but the big climbs, right, then I'm going to have a really fast time on the day. However, you can kind of go in and say, okay, let's go to this time analysis tab and look at the different things that I can vary and say, okay, well, what's going to really impact that time? So remember we said, okay, the average across this is saying that you're going to be at 0.281. So that's a lot. That's a large percentage of the time in those aero bars, right?
Yeah.
Indoor drafted, but yeah, like in the aero bars. If I, for whatever reason, can't hold it and end up spending a lot more time in that 3.4 range, okay, well, there's 34 minutes that I've added, or 35 minutes that I've added to my time by not being able to hold that aero position on that same power, right? So almost a mile per hour difference by not holding that aero position. Similarly, like I think our CR number here may be a little optimistic compared to what kind of what we would think from the numbers. And so if we switch our drag back to 0 and say, okay, we're going to be super aero, but maybe we're not as, the conditions or the road conditions aren't quite as good, or it's muddy or whatever else, you can start to see, okay, well, over the course, that starts to add a lot as well. And so the numbers we were seeing from some other tires, like 0.01 is kind of what we were in the range of. So there's another 30 minutes, right, if that CR number is drastically off, right? So you can start to look at it and say, okay, what are the big things that are going to matter on this course? And so road condition is obviously one. So if the road condition is worse, then you can start kind of adding, the speed is going to start looking more like 16 miles an hour, right? Like if it's a lot worse. Same thing, every time you sit up, you can think about it like I'm losing a mile per hour, right? Every time I sit up on my hoods. Similarly, if we drop our power down, 10% or 5%, and we're not able to hold that, you can start seeing how much time you start to give up, right? So in this case, you're at 150 average, 180-ish normalized. But if you drop 10 watts, that's 30 minutes, right? So for every 10 watts you're doing, and so you can kind of look at it in chunks like that and say, okay, I'm giving up, every 10 watts down, I'm giving up close-ish to a mile per hour. Every time I sit up, I'm giving up a mile per hour. If I do both, right, then I'm giving up a lot, right? And you can really kind of start to mentally like get that model going where you can say, okay, let me just stick that in my mindset as almost a mantra and say, okay, in these sections, especially sections with headwinds or sections that are kind of flat or whatever, stay aero, and you're getting a lot of benefit from that, right? So stay in that position that's as small as possible, right? One thing we've added that gets used by a lot of kind of like, I would say a lot of the pro teams and kind of elite racers, more so than general population, but is this idea of time delta distance, right? And so if I get rid of this cumulative effect, you can kind of see it a little bit better. But see these little spiky kind of black like line. What this is saying is in these spots, this has the biggest time difference per 100 meters. So if you look at like, okay, I'm going to reduce my drag. Okay, well, where are the places on the course where reducing the drag has the biggest benefit? And so, downhills, obviously, so you can kind of discount that. But in this flat section here, you have a big benefit of staying aero or flatter section. And so you can kind of say, okay, these are the areas where I want to make sure that I'm really focusing on that particular, aspect of my riding. Similarly, like if you looked at, obviously, if you dropped a weight, and that's something a lot of people are always like, okay, well, I'll just drop weight and I'll get a lot faster. Well, in this case, I think the rider was 170 pounds. Dropping 13 pounds only gains 11 minutes or so on the course, right? And how much effort is it to drop 13 pounds, and do you lose power and all that when you're trying to cut that weight, versus maintaining that aero, maintaining or increasing that aerodynamics, then you get huge benefits, right? For less, I guess without the downsides, right? Of trying to crunch that weight. If you do need to lose weight in general and just like trying to get down to race weight, then you get a benefit from it, regardless. But that shouldn't be the first thing that you're looking for to try and maximize your gains, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting ability there to segment out the course and say where can I make the biggest advantages with this, right? That's we did a little bit of Josh and I did a video not too long ago, and kind of a supporting blog post on using the aero bars and kind of when to focus on aero, when to focus on holding the best line possible. And if you can find in a course like this, if you look, there's a couple different sections there that are 20, 30 miles generally in one direction. There's a little wiggling, back and forth. But if you have a headwind in that section, man, I think we kind of modeled out a 10-mile section. If you're going in one direction with a headwind, that's and your wind speed is 50k an hour, you might be able to save 15 minutes just in that 10-mile section, and just get everybody that's ridden more than a few times has been out on a windy day where it's just absolutely brutal to get that wind over and over and over again. If you can cut that down a little bit, sure makes your day even just mentally a little bit easier.
Yeah, if I just kind of zero in on this section, it's similar. It's like it's got a headwind, crosswind, headwind kind of situation. But yeah, that's a good point. So like if you're just looking at that section and you can stay, let me jump it to like the non-aero, right, version of that. Yeah, and so just in that little 13-mile section, staying down, you're getting 3+ minutes, right? And you think about it and you go, okay, well, 3 minutes, but that's 3 extra minutes that you could use if you're trying to hit 12 hours or something. Like, that's 3 extra minutes you can use to recover, or like stop down, or use whatever it is that you need to do, right? Or you can bank that in case there's a flat or something like that. And there's 0 extra power required, right? Like, it's just like banking time. So.
Yeah, when you do that, when you have a 200-mile race, you can do that a few times and really bank a lot of time. And like you said, recover.
Exactly.
Make it can really even come down to as simple as, make sure you drink plenty before you get to this one really important section, so that you can drink a little less while you're in that section. If you can, if you're only reaching for a bottle 4 times instead of 6, that might be a big difference. Multiple minutes.
That's an interesting point, and kind of looking at it and say, like, okay, where you're going to want to drink and do that across the course. But if you look at it and say, okay, if I'm sitting up and I'm reducing power, where are the places where I'm losing the least amount of time, right? And then say, okay, well, this is the time where I need to like really load up on that nutrition, right? Because every, in this case, it looks like it's every 10 miles, there's a spot where you can be like, okay, I'm not losing that much time, by sitting up and by reducing power or whatever. So
stretch your back, or, any number of things like that.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I wanted to also point out is we kind of started to look at this concept of climb detection. And so there are not a lot of like long climbs there, but it's very deceptive, right? And this number may be a little misleading because we're kind of looking at an effective elevation. So it's kind of getting rid of little mini undulations that you wouldn't really notice. And so it's trying to look at like what is actually going to impact the race. So in actuality, I think there's closer to 9,000 or 8,000 feet on this, but the kind of effective elevation that changes your riding style might be a little bit less. But most of them, and the way we're categorizing climbs, we're kind of doing this auto detection of climbs, is most of them are short. And so meaning, 400 meters or 200 meters, a couple of half miles, one's a mile long. But the gradients are not all that high. So they're either very short with a steep gradient, or they're, a little bit longer with a very low gradient. But there's a lot of them, right? And so it's just something to kind of mentally get ready for in training, that, there'll be a lot of shorter 3 to 7% grade kind of climbs out there. And so when you're training, think about that and think about, okay, what kind of power numbers am I going to hit on these climbs? And as you can see, we've kind of categorized all of these. And then if you look at the power requirements for those, they're in the 220 to 250 kind of watt range. And so you have to be, physically ready to be able to repeat those over the course of the race. And every time that you reduce that wattage, and you'll go slower, right? So in this case, it's usually around 9 to 10 miles an hour is kind of the speed that you would hit for those kind of watts on that gradient. You can reduce these wattage, right, and spin it, but know that, okay, by doing that, I'm giving up a little bit of time, and that's okay if you need to do it, but it's just something to kind of keep in your mind that, okay, if I can do this, I can maximize kind of the overall race or the overall ride if I'm able to repeat these kind of efforts and then recover. So in training, you can take that and say, okay, well, let me go do 1 minute or 2 minute or 3 minute on at this kind of wattage, and then recover, and then go do it again and recover and go do it, and keep my average at that 150 range, but be able to kind of go into the tank and have the right nutrition and the right training going in to be able to handle that.
And is there a way to kind of export this so that you have it out on course, or is it top tube sticker style?
Yeah, no, there is.
notifications?
So we've added a couple different ways with Wahoo Element, for instance, or Wahoo Bolt or Roam. So any of their devices, there's a Best Bike Split integration. So if you have an account, you can connect Best Bike Split through the Wahoo Element app, and it'll pull the race file and the course file. The race file has the watt targets and the speed targets for each segment. So as you're riding, it uses a lat long, and based on these different points, it'll showcase kind of the power targets. What I would suggest on a very long ride like this is we have an option. So there's a lot of segments. There's like 500 segments, and that can be a little overwhelming. And so one of the things I tend to do and suggest is we have this option to reduce the number of intervals, right? And the model itself will still use the higher number of segments to get the accuracy, but the output will have a reduced number, and it combines the closest power targets that are, relative to each other. One may be, if you have a 155 target and then a 158 target, it'll combine that into a kind of a single target, right? For the places that makes the most sense. So just to kind of show what that looks like, I'll rerun the model with that. So if you run it like that, when it outputs to Wahoo, it'll have that smaller increment in it. The other option with Garmin is that we do have a push, and I can kind of show you here, a push the power course to Garmin Connect. That'll push the course and the basically a course file with course points to Garmin. Garmin limits it to 250 course points, so if you don't reduce the intervals down, it'll reduce it to 250 regardless. And there's a few specific settings on a Garmin that you have to make sure that you turn on for this to work properly. And there's also a data field that you need to download from Connect IQ. So a Best Bike Split data field in Connect IQ to download to provide the power targets for that.
Okay. I'm sure we can grab a link and put that in the description. So
yeah. So this kind of overlays. You can see the reduced set of intervals here that kind of gives you the the combined interval targets for the different sections. So.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see some people going, no, I'm not looking at my head unit to do a erg mode-esque route for 12 hours, but I can also see plenty of our listeners going, yeah, no, I want something to tell me exactly how hard to go.
We had somebody do race across France, I think. It was like a 500-kilometer race or something like that.
Ooh.
Yeah, which is, it's not that much. I guess it's 300 and something miles. But
yeah.
The other alternative, which is is super simple, is this idea of just a cheat sheet, right? And when you're out there, you kind of know what you're experiencing, right? And so if you're out there and it's relatively flat and there's a headwind, okay, this is the kind of power that I'm going to hold. If there's a tailwind, okay, I'm going to ease up. If there's a crosswind, somewhere in between, and then the different sections for the hills. So as I mentioned earlier, in this case, there's a lot of 3%, and then some 7%, and some. So you're looking at 220 to 250 is kind of the optimal power on those kind of hills to maintain that overall VI and that overall kind of IF for the race, right? So minor descents.
Yeah, that's great.
It's a lot of times you're just going to be coasting, right? So you're recovering. So in this case, you can almost ignore some of these numbers. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great to have that. Even if it's just you get that little bit tired. I just want to push over the top. I'm gonna stand up and just get over this, and that 600 watt dig that's gonna come back to bite you in a couple hours.
In some cases, this is a guide again. There'll be sections where you may have to. Just the gearing ratio that you have and being able to turn it over. You may have to go to 350 watts or whatever it is, just because you get that little steep section that you need to get over. But it's just something as a guideline to say, okay, most of the time I need to make sure that I'm kind of, this is the limit, right? Like 250 may be my limit, and I'm going to spin and just kind of maintain that so that I'm not exerting myself too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another couple things that you can do in training, and I know this is it's a lot, so you're not going to want to go do the whole thing in training, but if you wanted to break this down into sections, right now we don't have an easy way to do that, but you could basically go in and create a new model and say, okay, I'm going to focus on this 40 miles or this 35 miles in here, and I can take my course, re-upload it, cut it to this section, create a new model, and then export it to, say, Zwift, or export it to Training Peaks, and kind of do that workout, right? And say, okay, I'm gonna my key workout for this month is I'm gonna practice the efforts that are needed for this section of the course, right? And so you can output that. One of the cool things about the Training Peaks output too is if your users use Training Peaks is if you export this as a Training Peaks workout by distance, and then you go and do the workout, this race is Training Peaks by distance, and you go and do the race, then you can look at it and overlay it and say, okay, how did I compare to the actual ride? Like, where did I go above the power? Where did I go under? Where was I faster? Where was I slower? And you can kind of start to kind of dissect it post race, right?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think, especially for somebody that's doing some kind of event multiple times in a year, or I did Mid-South earlier in the year, and can go back and look at that one to see where I made some mistakes to not make them again the next time. Maybe going out at 90% of threshold for the first hour and a half is not ideal.
Yeah, you were killing it. You were so much faster at the first half. And then, yeah. And another thing that can be useful for is trying to set, like, a lot of times it is tricky, right? Like, there's a lot of variables that go in, and so CRR is one that's tricky to get for the road surface. So if you get out there and you're able to do a run, you kind of know what your CDA is now. You go and you hold that same line on the conditions out there, and you do a couple of runs of that. Then you can say, okay, well, what does that CRR look like on this course? And then I can use that to really refine the models. So.
Yeah. Hopefully, the couple days leading up to the race, we'll go out on course and do some Chung method testing out there and be able to come back with a...
I'm going to bet that this number is a little optimistic. So I'm thinking it's going to be closer to 0.01-ish, but it may be a little higher. But
yeah, we've done some modeling with both Boswell's winning time at Unbound and Keegan Swenson. That one was that we did actually through Best Pike Split at Steamboat. Totally different course, but I think the Keegan one was pretty good. I think we got within a watt or two of his average
nice.
For the day, and within 10 minutes, and given group dynamics and all that, thought that was pretty close. And it was, I think for Keegan we saw something like 007.
Oh, really? Okay. So,
nice.
Okay.
I think that one has a little bit more. They're known for the champagne gravel out there, but pretty smooth dirt road and decent amount of pavement. I think out there, a lot more than Emporia,
gotcha.
but I think we saw 008 or 085 for Boswell's win, something like that.
So maybe not so bad. Yeah, I've seen the pro times out there are so fast. It's so crazy. One thing that is not in here is the ability, and something that I know Rich, CEO, is looking at implementing is, mixed. So a lot of these races obviously have pavement and gravel and different sections, and so starting to figure out a way to pull in that data and then kind of segment up the course into the different sections that actually exist out there. To add that little extra to it. Another thing to kind of consider, we talked a little bit about weather data. This weather data is being pulled from a service, and so it'll obviously change as you get closer. So the forecast will get better, presumably, as you get closer to the race. And so that's something to keep track of and keep an eye on. Just because I know in years past, one thing that you can kind of think about with weather too is, at least in the pro race, sometimes you have these opportunistic places based on the wind conditions where, let's say you had a crosswind coming into the very kind of into the course, and you have this relatively long straightaway, right, for the last, whatever that is, 40 miles. If you had a pretty strong crosswind to a tailwind, for instance, then that could be a place that you'd want to really push and kind of try and do a break, because the amount of power, and again, if you go back to this kind of time analysis, if you do have a big tailwind, in this case I don't, it's, because it's the wind's not very strong in this model, but if you did have a big tailwind and you wanted to see like how much power it would take to reel somebody in, you can use this chart and say, okay, where are there low spikes or low points? So if I up the amount of power and I'm looking for kind of low points in this time delta distance, you can say, okay, there's a bunch of high points and then a bunch of low points following that. Then those high points would be a good place to try and make a break, knowing that even if they're pushing 20% more power, they're not making up very much ground, right?
Yeah.
And so you can kind of start to do some strategic analysis that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. As you're, sitting around in the Emporia dorm rooms or your Airbnb, the week of the race, you can kind of look through and see where. I immediately look at it, going, okay, well, I'm going to look and try to find the parts where I really need to be paying attention, and so that I can maybe put those on a top tube sticker kind of thing of, hey, at mile 62, probably going to turn into a crosswind or into a headwind, be ready for that. To me, that's a really valuable resource to have going in.
That's a new feature too. I should write that down. That's really nice.
Yeah. Awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think the the demo here was awesome. It does, I've played around with Best Bike Split for years, and I don't think I've ever known half of the features were there. So, really cool to see, and I definitely plan on using it for. I think we'll do some tire pressure testing, some more equipment, things like that. But then the pacing strategy, I know obviously that was kind of the idea for triathlon and time trial, but makes perfect sense in these gravel races where you're with people, with other riders sometimes, but I definitely wouldn't count on it for long.
Long points by yourself too, yeah. And one of the great things about even being with other riders too is if there is an opportunity for you to see a group or whatever and ride within yourself with that group for a while, or with that other person for a while, or whatever it is, you can kind of say, okay, if I see somebody, again, that pre-ride analysis or recon, you can say, okay, in these sections, that's a real big benefit. Like there's headwind in this section and this section, and it'd be great if there happens to be somebody, I'll jump in behind them and rest for a little while, right? And kind of bank that time. And I think I mentioned like gravel and these like ultra endurance rides and races, and Race Across America and Race Across France and Race Across Alaska and all these kind of things. Seen a ton of people being like using this for those kind of events. So it's definitely a growth area, I think, for the software. So
yeah. Well, awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. I know I learned a lot, so I hope everybody at home did too, and be able to kind of do their own testing and hopefully sign up for Best Bike Split and be able to model whether it's Unbound or whatever race they're going to go do next. So
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
It's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for coming aboard. Awesome. Well, thank you to Ryan for joining me. I found it really insightful. There was a bunch of stuff in there that I didn't know Best Bike Split did, whether it's setting your pacing intervals that and how to adjust those, or even almost a full course recon and good places to attack with weather on the day. So if you're at the pointy end of the race, it might be good for you there, or it might just be nice for somebody like me to know that it's about to get real hard. So get down and get tucked in your aero position and make the day just a little bit easier for you. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Leave a comment, like below, and let us know if there's anything else you want us to talk about before we get to Emporia. We'll see you there.